Okay, welcome to day 2, video 2. We are going to start off with a little bit of a recap before we jump on into some of the stuff about World War I. So, you'll remember that there were 4 main reasons for World War I, and those were militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And you can remember that by using the acronym MAIN. There was also a lot of tension between countries on the Balkan Peninsula, aka the Powder Keg. The assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip was the spark that set off the whole powder keg, and shortly thereafter, the world was at war. So, by 1914, the battle lines were pretty firmly drawn. There were allies and there were Central Powers. And by the way, the Central Powers were called that because they were centrally located in Europe. They were right in the heart, the middle of Europe. Now, Germany has a pretty big problem. Okay, so let's take a look at our map. Here we go. If you look at where Germany is positioned, you can see that they are surrounded by allied nations, specifically Russia, France, and Great Britain. So this means that Germany has to fight a two-front war. They're having to fight off the enemy from 2 different places. You should remember that Kaiser Wilhelm II is ruling Germany at this point. His goal was to conquer the Allied forces, of course, and by conquer, know that I mean on both fronts. He wanted to take over Paris, the capital city of France, as well as St. Petersburg in Russia. He once said that he would have Paris for lunch, dinner in St. Petersburg. So take a second and think about that. So, if you wrote something or answered something along the lines of he thought that the war would be a quick and easy one, or that he thought he wouldn't have any trouble conquering the Allied powers, you're on the right track. German military leaders also thought that Russia would be easy to defeat because they were not as industrialized as other European nations. Its railroads were not as developed. And Germany knew Russia would have a difficult time getting troops and supplies to the front lines of fighting. All right, so by the fall of 1914, only a few months into the war was already a bloody stalemate, meaning that no one was winning the war. The 2 sides were deadlocked in northern France, which became the Western Front. Now, Germany's solution was the Schlieffen Plan. Okay, I've posted a video link on Schoology, a real quick video about 8 minutes long about why the Schlieffen Plan failed. So be sure to check that out. No notes to take. I just want you to watch it, answer a couple of questions. So this meant getting to France as fast as possible to take them out and then hurrying back through Germany to fight Russia on the Eastern Front. Of course, to get to Paris, they marched through Belgium, which you already know is a problem because Belgium was a neutral country. Well, Germany got close to Paris, but they were not successful. Great Britain and France were able to defend Paris and hold off the Germans. Okay, so let's take a look at the Western Front, specifically the Battle of the Marne. The first Battle of the Marne was probably the most important event of the war. On September 5th, 1914, the Allies attacked German forces northeast of Paris near the Marne River. Every available soldier was rushed to the front lines. Even taxi cabs helped to get soldiers to the battle. Over 600 taxis rushed from Paris to get soldiers to the fight. The Germans were defeated at the Battle of Marne, which resulted in a failed Schlieffen Plan, because it was now obvious that it was not going to be a quick battle in the West. So remember a few minutes ago, I said that by the fall of 1914, both sides were in a stalemate? Well, both sides had been deadlocked in northern France, and they had turned to trench warfare. The land between the trenches was called no man's land. And when the orders were given, soldiers climbed out of the trenches and into no man's land. They would have been rained down on by machine gun fire, and snipers always kept a close eye on the opposing trench. Simply staying in the trench didn't guarantee your safety either. Artillery fire could easily reach the trenches. Now here's an eyewitness account from a French soldier. He wrote, "Shells of all calibers kept raining on our sector. The trenches disappeared, filled with earth. The air was unbreathable. Our blinded, wounded, crawling, and shouting soldiers kept falling on top of us and died, splashing us with blood. It was a living hell." So please understand that life in the trenches was not like you see in the movie sometimes. The Western Front stretched almost 500 miles from the North Sea to the border of Switzerland. Trench warfare was a method of defense, though. Troops had dug miles and miles of parallel trenches to stay protected from enemy fire. Life in the trenches, definitely horrible. One soldier wrote, "The men slept in mud, washed in mud, ate mud, and dreamed mud. The rats were terrible, as well as the lice. Fresh food was certainly not available, and it was almost impossible to sleep." Now, the Eastern Front of World War I was between the Baltic and the Black Sea. The Eastern Front was Russia fighting against Germany and the Austria-Hungary, in between Austria-Hungary. Russia was at an advantage in that they had more manpower, and while there was more mobile fighting here, stalemate was common on this front as well. While Russia was at an advantage regarding number of soldiers available, they were at a major disadvantage because they were not as industrialized as other nations. The Battle of Tannenberg is when the Germans had counterattacked the Russians and Serbians at the end of August. It was a 4-day battle, and the Germans crushed the Russian army and forced them to retreat. More than 30,000 Russian soldiers were killed. This was devastating to Russia as it lost half its army and had 90,000 soldiers taken prisoner. So there are two important locations that you need to know for the Ottoman Front. The first one is the Dardanelles Straits, right here. And the other is Gallipoli, which is right there. The Ottoman Turks and Bulgaria allied themselves with Germany and the Central Powers. The Allies decided that the Dardanelles would be the best place to attack the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a very narrow sea strait, and it was a gateway to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, which was Constantinople, the capital of the empire. The Allies believed that if they could control the Dardanelles and Constantinople, then it would be easy to defeat the Turks and therefore establish a way to get supplies to Russia. Now, this strategy became known as the Gallipoli Campaign. Troops from Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and France attacked. Great Britain and France sent ships to bomb the peninsula and then sent troops on the ground. However, the Turks were absolutely relentless and would not give up. Another stalemate had been reached. Because of the stalemate, Great Britain and France gave up the campaign and evacuated. Between the two armies, about 250,000 men had died. So, what makes this war different than all the other ones that we've discussed this year? Well, this is the first industrialized war. Countries now had the ability to mass produce weapons, meaning that weapons were made in factories like the artillery gun factory pictured here. Because these weapons were being made in a factory, they were identical to all the other weapons coming out of the factory and therefore more consistent and more precise. But there was a whole slew of new technology that was used in this war. We've already talked about one of these advancements, trenches. Soldiers from both sides of the war used trenches to fight from within. This is also the first time we see submarines used on a big scale as well. You will also hear these referred to as U-boats sometimes. In 1914, Germany began using submarines on a large scale as an effective warship. The primary weapon it used, because it was underwater, was the torpedo. Tanks were also widely used for the first time. The tank was an armored combat vehicle that moved on chain tracks, which allowed it to go over rough land and barbed wire. Obviously, they were nowhere near as sophisticated as what we have nowadays, but tanks were introduced to the battlefield by the British in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. Airplanes were also used, which is pretty amazing when you think about how the Wright brothers had their first successful flight in December of 1903, and by 1914 it was essential to military victory. Planes were used for various things like reconnaissance, dropping bombs on the other side of enemy lines, and also to shoot at one another in the air. And by the way, in case you did not know, these airplane fights in the air are called dogfights. The machine gun was also an essential weapon during World War I. Improved machine guns could now wipe out entire waves of enemy troops, which would make it difficult for troops to advance. Poison gas, or mustard gas, was introduced by the Germans during World War I. However, both sides of the war used poison gas. The effects of some of the gases were absolutely horrific. It caused blindness or severe blisters, while other forms of poison gas would result in death by choking. Soldiers did wear gas masks, as did some animals, but as you can see from the photo, these masks were not very effective at all. Okay, so that wraps up video 2. When we get into day 3, we're going to talk about how the U.S. got involved into the war, and that will be our last video for this unit. So please make sure you pause, rewind, make sure you've answered all the questions. Remember, if you restart this video, you need to make sure you, again, answer all the questions, okay? I'll see you in class.